Supah Ritz, Volume 2, Chapter 8, Becoming a Player. About midway through my 4-year tenure at Phoenix Pictures, I decided it was time to move on. I was making a pittance by Hollywood standards, and my ascendancy felt like it was stalling out. Marcia Nassiter, who had become a valuable mentor to me, had left the company to retire, though no one in Hollywood ever really retires. And Rick Hess, my old boss from William Morris, had come over to take her place as the new president of production. It was a blessing and a curse to have Rick. It was nice to have an ally and a fan at the top of the food chain, but I also worried that I now had a boss who might struggle to see me as anything more than an assistant. I also had misgivings about the financial viability of the company. Mike wanted to make star-driven prestige films, Oscar movies, marketed toward grown-up audiences. I loved these films. The English Patient was my favorite movie of that year, but these movies were getting more and more expensive to make, and Phoenix Pictures' greenlight capacity maxed out at $18 million. We were getting forced to lay off our more prestigious and expensive projects on the major studios. The Thin Red Line went to Fox. My own project, Vertical Limit, went to Sony. It became clear that if I wanted a career in big, important filmmaking, Phoenix was maybe not the vehicle. What's more, as I started attending Vertical Limit meetings at Sony, striding onto the old MGM lot and into the hallowed Thalberg building to sit with the big dogs, I found the trappings of Hollywood power irresistibly seductive. Maybe it was just an illusion. The imposing gates and sniveling underlings, designed to give lie to the chaos inherent in big-time movie-making. But it was a convincing illusion. I believed if I became a part of it, maybe I too could tame the chaos that roiled beneath my skin. I decided to get a studio job. My first call was naturally to my sometimes mentor, John Brody, who was, I believe, still working at Variety. He quickly set me up with a breakfast meeting with Uber agent Robert Newman. This was basically how it worked. If you wanted a job, you had to have a powerful agent in your corner who would, ideally, place calls for you and find you the gig. I had never done any business with Newman, but he had a client roster that included Guillermo del Toro, Danny Boyle, Robert Rodriguez, and Baz Luhrmann, to name a few. That was basically unrivaled in Hollywood. I don't remember much about our breakfast. We met at the newsroom on Robertson, and Robert was gracious and engaged, but I felt like I was out of my league, a child suddenly seated at the grown-up table, struggling to talk politics. Maybe he felt it too. He told Brody he thought I should stay put. He's like Marilyn on the Munsters over there, the one normal one. He's not going to find a better opportunity at some studio. Maybe he was right, but I'd caught a glimpse of that mirage shimmering behind the studio gates, and I was not giving up on it. There was also the ongoing problem that I didn't feel comfortable sharing with any agent, of Phoenix's precarious financial state. Our first 4 movies, The Mirror Has Two Faces, The People vs. Larry Flint, Swept from the Sea, and Bryan Singer's apt Pupil, marred by a lawsuit from underage male extras claiming they had been forced to perform naked, had not only failed, but failed so spectacularly that they gutted the entire reinsurance market that was key to our financing structure. When George Stevens Jr., son of the legendary director and founder of the AFI, was brought on to shepherd the Thin Red Line through development, he sent a memo to Mike claiming that Phoenix was a quote-unquote sewer of incompetence. I feared he was right. For our next film, Oliver Stone's U-Turn, we had to engineer a completely new financing structure. When our CFO famously quipped at one of our staff meetings that we all had no idea how much money a box office success in U-Turn might generate for Phoenix, I whispered to our head of business affairs, and neither does he. Banking on U-Turn to staunch the bleeding felt like a fool's wager. I had to get out. Thankfully, Newman was not my only resource. I still had my network of friends, and by some stroke of luck, I enjoyed a lot of luck and serendipity back then, Cara Francis, now at Amazon, reached out to me to ask if I'd be interested in a creative exec job, the lowest rung on the studio ladder, CEs as they were known, at Fox. Cara at the time was working as an exec at New Regency, founded by the arms dealer Arnon Milchan, and was dating Damian Stevenson, a young hotshot executive who had just left Fox to join Spielberg's startup, DreamWorks. Damian, whom I had never met, suggested me for the job. I was wildly flattered that anyone knew my name at all, and thrilled for the opportunity. I went in for the interview and sat in a room with Sanford Panich, current Sony Prez, and Peter Rice, who went on to run Disney. They couldn't have been more personable and gregarious, but I did not get the job. They sent me some absurdly stupid script to read about the largest sniper gun ever built. It was a sci-fi action flick, and I'm pretty sure the title was Sniper! I spent a whole weekend back home, visiting family, perched at my dad's kitchen counter, where I had once had so much luck as a student and college applicant, writing reams of notes on how to make the script better. There's something particularly torturous about writing notes on a script you know nothing about. Do the execs even understand how bad it is? You have to summarize the bad parts to demonstrate their idiocy, dissect their ineffectiveness, and prescribe a cure. It's almost impossible to not write something totally convoluted. My sniper notes were no exception. And I don't think I ever heard from them again. In Hollywood, no news is always bad news. Still, it was not the only meeting I was able to book. My friend Dee Dee Gardner at Paramount got me in to meet for a job opening in the CE ranks on her lot. This round of meetings was a much more formal affair. The senior execs at Paramount carved out an afternoon where I moved from one office to the next, answering questions about my favorite movies and directors, work ethic, and relationships around town. I always found these meetings profoundly demoralizing. I didn't have an encyclopedic knowledge of film, so I had to cram for the interviews and memorize answers before I went in. There was nothing authentic about the conversations, and every question felt like a potential gotcha moment. What's more, I knew they were looking for a tentpole guy, the kind of exec that loves big action movies and would be great at putting them together, and this was not who I was. I wanted to make Anthony Minghella films. But I felt it was a stupid categorization anyway. At Phoenix, we developed all kinds of movies. Whether it was a thriller or a comedy, it still had to have the fundamentals of great storytelling. Compelling characters, mounting stakes, a ticking clock. Action movies needed all these elements too, and I couldn't believe that Paramount wouldn't see things the same way. I started my round of meetings at Dee Dee's office. She was still a CE back then, and all the junior execs were crammed in some second-floor slum, the dressing room building, with no air conditioning. The offices were not as nearly as nice as the one I already occupied at Phoenix. Still, it felt glamorous to me, the former wardrobe department haunted by the ghosts of the silver screen. So what if there was some hazing of the lower ranks at the studios? There was bound to be a price for glamour. Dee Dee gave me the scouting report on each exec, and then walked me over to the stately Marathon building to start my sessions. My first meeting was with an affable guy named Orrin Koulis. He was a former professional hockey player turned producer. I can't remember what stroke of good fortune had brought him onto the studio lot. By the time I sat down with him, you got the feeling he already had one foot out the door. He would subsequently produce the James Wan hit Saw, and make so much money he would go on to purchase an NHL franchise with his winnings. The tenor of our talk was entirely cautionary. He asked me some questions, but mostly he advised me against taking the job because it meant working with one of the most miserable groups of humans on the planet. In fact, as our interview neared the end of its allotted time, he told me I'd better get moving, because my next movie was with one of his colleagues who also happened to be the biggest bitch on the face of the planet. If I was late, I'd never hear the end of it. Wow. I hustled out of his office with my balls in my throat. Despite Orrin's warnings, I did not get major bitch vibes from my next meeting, but it didn't go great either. When the exec asked me my favorite movie of the past 12 months, I drew a complete blank. I knew I couldn't say the truth, The English Patient, because I was there to be the action guy. And the only action movie I could think of was Jurassic Park. What a dumb answer. An expensive movie that offered nothing, really, in the way of attitude or point of view or insight into the marketplace beyond its groundbreaking visual effects. A very bad answer for a story guy. Her face betrayed nothing, but that was answer enough. I could tell I blew the interview. I was next hustled over to sit down with Don Granger. I don't know his reputation in Hollywood now, but back then my friends who knew him spoke of him with an air of jocular respect. He would go on to run Tom Cruise's company, David Ellison's company, and I suppose he's running Paramount right now. He asked me some of the most interesting and challenging questions I have ever been asked in an interview. I remember 3 of them. First, he asked me why they should hire someone like me who had no life experience outside of Hollywood. Wouldn't they be better off hiring someone who had done something interesting with their life and could draw on that experience for storytelling? What? I thought. I got his drift. Wasn't the whole point to hire someone with film experience? I explained, and kind of believed at the time, that my own human intuition was particularly adroit. It enabled me to process my experiences in a way that gave me unique insight into the human condition that was profound, even if my experiences themselves felt narrow. He challenged the premise, but couldn't prove it wrong, so ultimately acquiesced. Next, he asked me if there was a movie that everyone loved in the recent past that I secretly despised. I didn't totally get what he was going for and took a beat to think, which he filled with further explanation. You know, he said, it's a movie all the critics love and your friends are raving about that you secretly can't stand. The right answer drifted into my brain with a kind of horrific materialization, like Satan appearing in the desert to tempt Christ. Was I really this corrupt? Was I willing to trade my integrity for a job, to make a deal with the devil to get ahead? But this was Hollywood after all, and you weren't going to make it if you weren't willing to sacrifice everything, especially your integrity. The English Patient, I offered tentatively, waiting to be struck down where I sat. And Don smacked his hands together in abject glee. Yes, he howled, rolling back in his chair. I hated that film. I kept my smile plastered to my face like I had just been turned into a pillar of salt. It wasn't that hard. I was like a wildcatter who just hit a gusher, and his joy was infectious enough to overcome my wilting soul. My wife and I make fun of that movie all the time. How slowly they all spoke. My God, he began a slow, stilting send-up of my favorite film's dialogue. But if I were to get my own coffee, would you bring it here to me? He howled with delight as I sat there dumbfounded. I had in truth not noticed the slow cadence of the film's dialogue. Why would I? It was my favorite film. Perhaps the wanton betrayal of my own core values is what gummed up the works for the next question. I was, I believe, fully blushing by now when he finally stopped laughing and got serious again. Okay, he said. Now do the opposite. What's a film that everyone hated that you secretly loved? And I drew a blank. Maybe I was still stunned that Hollywood was so insidious I really could advance my career by stabbing my own heart. Also, the question's logic required too much math for me to address. How do I betray myself a second time? So asymmetrically, it answers this next question. He looked at me expectantly, his face still lit up by my last response. But as time ticked by, I watched his smile fade as he gave up and waved it off. That's okay, he said. Mine's Demolition Man. But I could tell my blank had killed my shot. I had been so close. I wish I'd been faster on my feet. I did have a weak spot for schlocky crap. I loved Terminal Velocity in all its glorious stupidity. Full stop. I wished I'd been able to remember that. Somewhere in the process, I met with the president of the production, Michelle Manning. She seemed smart and competent, but expressed misgivings that I suspect are what ultimately doomed my campaign. She knew my friends. She felt my crowd was too privileged, too entitled for its own good, but conceded I was more impressive than my reputation had led her to believe. Honestly, I was kind of thrilled I had a reputation. Ultimately, Tom Boland, an owl-eyed exec with a hairless pate whose job it was to manage all the Paramount CEs, called a few weeks later to give me the news. I think if it were up to any of us as individuals, he told me, the job would be yours. But as a group, we just couldn't get there. A pass is a pass, I always say. It doesn't have to make sense. As I licked my wounds back at the Phoenix office, refiling every fantasy I'd had, quitting my job in a blaze of glory to start my new life on the studio lot, it occurred to me that maybe the executive route was not the path I should be pursuing. Maybe instead of the trappings of great filmmaking, I should try my hand at actual no-bullshit filmmaking. I might be up to it, the rough and tumble of set life. It was a challenge that excited me. Maybe I could be one of those feisty coordinators clicking snappy retorts into my walkie as I strode toward Video Village. Someday, I'd return to the executive ranks wiser and weathered, a list of big-game kills ticked off on my resume. I realized there was a job right in front of me that fit the bill. Once Sony had picked up Vertical Limit, Gareth Wiggin, the erudite vice chairman of Sony Pictures Entertainment, had assigned the project to Ron Bass, Rain Man, to do the rewrite. Ron was notorious at the time for being the most expensive writer in town who didn't actually do any writing. He took on project after project, but allegedly he had a team of baby writers, the Bassinettes, who did all the actual work, while Ron took all the credit. It was a pretty scandalous allegation, I thought, but one that circulated openly around town. So when Ron came in to pitch us his take on the material, he was animated and versant and excited to tackle the script. We were all wary, but Christy, I believe, addressed the elephant in the room. When can you start, she asked, and how much writing do you yourself actually do? Ron took the question in stride. He must have been aware of the rumors himself. My team, he answered unflinchingly, will start right away. I don't remember how he addressed the question of his personal contribution, except to acknowledge there was a process that went without saying had generated a lot of success. He was unapologetic. He and his team spent 3 weeks on the project. I believe Sony paid them $750,000. At the end of it, we had a new script. It was deeper and more character-driven, and in my opinion, much better. Sony greenlit it immediately. They hired Roger Spottiswoode, hot off the latest Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies, to direct. And after failing to secure a job at Paramount or Fox, I nominated myself to be his assistant. Medavoy was skeptical of the move. Over his career, he had been involved in over 300 films. Why would you give up that kind of influence to work on just one thing for the foreseeable future, he asked. It was also a step back. I'd be giving up my executive job to become, again, an assistant. He advised me to ask for a producing credit as additional compensation. This felt like a no-brainer, a good move, and the ultimate resume builder, a real-life credit on an actual film. It also proved the deal breaker. I asked for a co-producer credit, one of the lowlier producing credits, and Roger balked. I don't think he really liked me to begin with, but the credit request gave him ample reason to torpedo the play. Other people might prove more deserving of the credit. The first AD, for instance, he argued, and he did not want to box himself in this early in the process. By that point, there was no way I was walking away from my golden handcuffs without a producing credit, so the job fell through. Ultimately, the studio pulled the plug on that version of the movie anyway. I'm not sure why, and it doesn't really matter. A pass is a pass, after all. Roger pivoted to the Noriega film, and I went back to my sad office on the second floor of the Frankovich building. I figured my career at Phoenix was probably over. I'd spent some of my capital on a gambit that failed. What's more, I'd shown my hand. I clearly wasn't enjoying being an executive, and they had to figure I would try to find some other way to leave if they didn't just fire me right then. When my old boss, Rick Hess, called me into his office, I figured I was getting the talk. Instead, he presented me with new business cards. They read, Nick Morton, Vice President of Development, Phoenix Pictures Development Corporation. I was confused at first, and then honestly, mostly annoyed. It's like when your parents got you a new parka for Christmas, but what you really wanted was that CB parka that all the cool kids had. The parka wasn't the point. The CB was the point. But you can't really say that on Christmas morning without looking like an asshole. And honestly, I think that was the point of the way this promotion went down. Sandbagging me with kindness left me little room to maneuver. I didn't want to be a vice president of development. Development was the wan land of limp-wristed gossips. I wanted to be a VP of production. Production was where the movies got made. Production was the land of the gunslingers and the swagger. Development felt like a dig, a well-calculated backhanded compliment intended to keep me in my place. What's worse was this quote-unquote Phoenix Pictures Development Corporation. I had never heard of this company, and when pressed, Rick conceded it was basically a made-up entity, a way to give me a promotion without getting permission from the actual Phoenix board. The promotion also did not come with any sort of raise. In essence, the whole thing was fake. But this was Hollywood after all. Everything here was fake. Sure, I was just the VP of diddly squat productions, but I was the VP of something. Maybe it was just an illusion, but I was pretty sure Hollywood couldn't tell the difference. My cards told the world I was a player now, and on some level, I believed that might be enough.